It was 9:17 in the morning, January 22nd, 1943. The heat on Guadalcanal was already enough to choke a man, a wet, heavy blanket that smelled of rotting vegetation and mud. But Second Lieutenant John George wasn't thinking about the heat. He wasn't thinking about the sweat stinging his eyes or the insects buzzing around his ears. He was crouched in the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker, his body pressed against the dirt, staring through a glass scope that every other officer in his battalion had laughed at for 6 weeks. 240 yards away, a massive banyan tree rose out of the jungle floor like a twisted hand reaching for the sky. Somewhere in that tangle of vines and branches, a Japanese sniper was waiting. For the last 3 days, that sniper and his partners had turned the coconut groves of Point Cruz into a slaughterhouse. They had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. They were ghosts. They fired from nowhere, vanished into nothing, and left the men of the 132nd Infantry Regiment terrified to lift their heads. John George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. His platoon leaders called it a mail-order sweetheart. When he first unpacked the weapon back in Tennessee, the armorer had looked at the sleek, civilian lines of the gun and asked, with a smirk, if George was planning to hunt deer or fight a war. George had told them the truth. It was for the Japanese. They laughed then. They weren't laughing now. Now, the lives of his entire unit depended on whether that mail-order rifle could do the one thing the standard-issue military weapons couldn't: hit a man-sized target, hidden in deep shadow from 3 football fields away. To understand why a 27-year-old lieutenant was lying in the mud with a civilian hunting rifle, you have to understand the desperation of the moment. The 132nd Infantry was breaking. They had relieved the Marines in late December, thinking the worst of the fighting was over. They were wrong. The Marines had taken the airfield, but they hadn't cleared the jungle. The Japanese forces had retreated into the massive trees west of the Matnikau River. They dug in. They didn't build bunkers. They became part of the forest. They used Arisaka Type 98 rifles, fitted with scopes, and they knew the terrain better than they knew their own names. They knew how to wait. They knew how to let a patrol walk right past them, wait for the rear guard, and put a bullet through a man's neck before the sound of the shot even registered. On January 19th, a corporal named Davis was filling canteens at a creek. He never heard the shot. He just slumped forward into the water. The next day, 2 more men died on patrol. On the 3rd day, 3 more. One of them was shot from a tree the Americans had walked past twice. The morale of the battalion was bleeding out faster than the wounded men. You can fight an enemy you can see. You can storm a bunker. You can return fire at a machine gun nest. But you cannot fight the jungle itself. And that's what it felt like. The trees were killing them. The battalion commander, a man named Captain Morris, was at his wit's end. His men were dying faster than malaria could take them. He didn't need more soldiers, he needed a solution. That night, he summoned George to his tent. The mockery was gone. The jokes about the deer hunter were gone. Morris looked at the young lieutenant and asked a simple, heavy question. Can that rifle of yours actually hit anything? George didn't boast. He didn't brag. He just gave the captain the numbers. He told him about the Illinois State Championship he'd won in 1939. He told him about putting 5 rounds inside a 4-inch circle at 300 yards. He told him that while the standard M1 Garand was a fine battle implement, it was a blunt instrument compared to what he had sitting in his tent. The Garand was semi-automatic, fired 8 rounds, and rattled when you shook it. It had iron sights, heavy pieces of metal that covered up a target at long range. George's rifle was a Winchester Model 70, bolt action, 5 rounds, fitted with a Lyman Alaskan scope and a trigger that broke like a glass rod. It was a precision instrument built for one thing: surgical accuracy. George had spent his own money, 2 years of National Guard pay, to buy it. He had fought the army bureaucracy to keep it. He had watched other men clean their government-issued weapons while he sat in a warehouse in Illinois, waiting to be forwarded through the military mail. When that crate finally arrived, marked fragile, he treated it like gold. Captain Morris listened. Then he gave George an order that would change the course of the battle. He gave him until morning. Prove it, he said. Go out there and stop them. That night, George didn't sleep. He sat in his tent, the rain drumming against the canvas, and stripped the Winchester down. It had been packed in cosmoline, a thick, greasy preservative, for the ocean voyage. He cleaned every inch of steel. He checked the scope mounts, tightening the screws until his knuckles turned white. He loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 ammunition, not military issue, but hunting rounds he had packed himself back in Tennessee. At dawn, he moved out. He didn't take a squad. He didn't take a radio. He took a canteen, 60 rounds of ammunition, and the rifle they had all marked. He crept into the ruins of the captured bunker and began to watch the trees. This was the hardest part of sniper warfare. It's not the shooting, it's the seeing. The jungle is a wall of green. Shadows shift, leaves flutter. Vines twist like snakes. A sniper has to look through the noise and find the anomaly. The banyan trees in the grove were ancient monsters, some reaching 90 feet into the air, with trunks 8 feet thick. A Japanese soldier could climb one before the sun came up, tie himself to a branch, and sit motionless for 12 hours. He wouldn't look like a man. He would look like a dark knot of wood. George settled the Winchester onto a sandbag. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate down. He put his eye to the scope. The magnification was low, only 2.5 power, but it gathered light. It cut through the gloom. He scanned slowly, left to right, top to bottom. He divided the world into grids, checking every fork in the branches, every patch of shadow. Minutes turned into an hour. The sun climbed higher. The heat began to rise, shimmering off the jungle floor. Most men would have lost focus. Their eyes would have glazed over. But George was a competition shooter. He knew how to switch off the part of his brain that felt boredom and turn up the part that detected motion. At 9:17 a.m., he saw it. It wasn't a man. It was a branch that moved when there was no wind. George froze. He locked the scope onto a fork in the banyan tree, 240 yards away, 87 feet up. He waited. The branch moved again. A slow, deliberate shift. Then, through the lens, the shape resolved itself. It was a patch of dark clothing, darker than the bark, a shoulder, a head. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where the Americans brought up their supplies. He was hunting. He had no idea he was being hunted. George made his calculations instantly. 240 yards, no wind to speak of. He adjusted his aim slightly to the right, compensating for the drift. He exhaled, emptying his lungs halfway, and held it. His finger found the trigger. It was a 3.5-pound pull, smooth and crisp. The officers had laughed. The armorer had sneered. "Is this for deer or Germans?" George squeezed. The rifle kicked into his shoulder, a solid, familiar punch. The crack of the shot whipped through the jungle, startling the birds into a frenzy. Through the scope, George didn't blink. He saw the impact. The dark shape in the tree jerked violently. The rifle slipped from the figure's hands, tumbling down through the leaves. A second later, the body followed. It fell 90 feet, crashing through the canopy, hitting the ground with a heavy, final thud near the base of the massive trunk. George didn't cheer. He didn't relax. He worked the bolt of the Winchester. The empty brass casing flew out, spinning in the air, and he shoved the bolt forward, chambering a fresh round. He stayed on the scope. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. If there was one, there was another. The shot would have alerted the partner. He would be looking, searching for the muzzle flash, trying to find where the death had come from. The jungle went silent, holding its breath. George scanned the nearby trees. He knew the second man was there. He could feel it. 20 minutes passed. The sweat was pouring down George's face now, stinging his eyes, but he didn't wipe it away. Movement meant death. At 9:43, he found him, 60 yards north of the first tree. This sniper was lower, maybe 50 feet up. He was moving, trying to retreat down the trunk. He had realized his position was compromised and was trying to slip away into the undergrowth. He was fast, but the Winchester was faster. George tracked him through the scope. He led the target, aiming just below the descending figure. He fired. The second sniper was blown backward off the trunk. He hit the jungle floor seconds later. 2 shots. 2 kills. The toy rifle had just done in 30 minutes what an entire infantry battalion had failed to do in 3 days. But the war wasn't going to let him simply sit there and pick them off. At 11:21, the jungle answered back. A bullet slammed into the sandbag 6 inches from George's head, spraying dirt into his face. The crack of the shot came a split second later. George rolled left, slamming his back against the bunker wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had been spotted. The shot had come from the southwest. A third sniper. This one hadn't run, he had hunted the hunter. George lay in the dirt, wiping the grit from his eyes. He waited 3 minutes, counting the seconds in his head. Then, slowly, inch by painful inch, he moved back to his firing position. He didn't look where he had been looking before. He swung the rifle toward the southwest. The Japanese sniper would have moved immediately after firing. That was the rule. Shoot and move. But in a jungle this dense, you couldn't move far without making noise. George scanned a cluster of 5 banyan trees. He looked for the unnatural shape, the straight line in a world of curves. At 11:38, he saw him. Third tree from the left, 73 feet up. The sniper had shifted to a different branch but had made a fatal error. He stayed in the same tree. He thought he was hidden by the thick vines. George settled the crosshairs. The mockery of the past 6 weeks felt like a lifetime ago. There was only this moment. The breathing, the trigger, the recoil. The third sniper fell without a sound. By noon, word had spread through the American lines. The men who had been cowering in foxholes, afraid to move, began to lift their heads. The story passed from foxhole to foxhole. The lieutenant with the mail-order gun was wiping them out. Soldiers who had laughed at the sweetheart rifle started creeping up to the bunker, asking if they could watch. They wanted to see the show. George turned them away. This wasn't a spectator sport. Every extra pair of eyes was a risk. Every movement drew fire. By the time the sun began to dip low, casting long, dangerous shadows across the groves, George had silenced 5 Japanese snipers. The grove, which had been a place of terror all morning, was eerily quiet. The Japanese had realized that something had changed. The easy kills were gone. There was a predator in the trees, and for the first time in the campaign, it wasn't them. Captain Morris was waiting when George returned to headquarters at 1600 hours. He didn't ask if the rifle was a toy anymore. He didn't ask about deer hunting. He just looked at the tired, sweat-soaked lieutenant and asked one thing. "Can you go back out at dawn?" George nodded. But as he cleaned his rifle that night, removing the carbon and the jungle grit, he knew the next day would be different. The element of surprise was gone. The enemy knew he was there. They knew his position. And there were still 6 snipers left out there in the dark. The easy part was over. Now, the duel would really begin. January 23rd began with the kind of rain you only see in the tropics. It wasn't just water, it was a wall. It hammered the jungle floor, turning the dirt into a thick, sucking mud and reducing visibility to 0. For most soldiers, the rain was miserable. For a sniper, it was cover. George sat in the darkness of his bunker, listening to the deluge. He knew what was happening out there in the grey mist. The enemy was moving. The sound of the rain would mask their footsteps. The curtain of water would hide their climb. They were repositioning, using the weather against him. When the rain finally stopped at 8:15, the jungle began to steam. The sun cut through the clouds, and the visibility returned. George wiped his scope lens with a dry cloth he kept wrapped in oilskin. He brought the rifle up. At 9:12, he saw the result of the rain. A Japanese soldier had used the storm to climb a tree 290 yards out. That was 50 yards further back than the day before. They were learning. They knew the range of the average American rifleman, and they were staying just outside of it. They thought they were safe. They didn't know about the Winchester. 290 yards is a long shot in combat. Your heart is beating fast. The heat waves distort the air, but George didn't hesitate. He knew his holdover. He knew his ballistics. He settled the crosshair, exhaled, and sent the 6th round of the campaign downrange. The sniper fell, but this time the jungle didn't go silent. This time the jungle exploded. At 9:57, a high-pitched whistle screamed out of the sky. Crump. A mortar shell slammed into the earth 40 yards short of George's bunker. Dirt and shrapnel sprayed the trees. George froze. They weren't just hunting him with rifles anymore. They had spotters watching the muzzle flash. They had triangulated his position. Crump. The second shell landed 20 yards short. They were walking the fire in. bracketing him. The next one wouldn't be short. George didn't think. He grabbed the Winchester and scrambled out the back of the bunker. He didn't look back. He sprinted north, his boots slipping in the mud, diving lungs first into a shallow shell crater along the tree line. Seconds later, the world behind him disintegrated. The third salvo hit the bunker dead center. Sandbags, logs, and earth were vaporized in a cloud of black smoke. If he had stayed for 10 more seconds, he would have been nothing but a memory. He lay in the crater, gasping for air, clutching the rifle to his chest. The game had changed. This wasn't target practice. This was a duel. They knew he was there. They knew he was dangerous. And they were throwing everything they had at him. He couldn't go back to the bunker. He crawled to a fallen tree 120 yards north. It offered cover and a clear view of the groves. He settled in. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They were aggressive now. They were hunting him back. At 14:23, George spotted a glint of metal in the canopy. He fired, his 7th kill. An hour later, at 15:41, he found the 8th man. This one had climbed 94 feet up a massive banyan, trying to get the height advantage. But the height just silhouetted him against the bright afternoon sky. George took the shot. The man fell for what seemed like forever before hitting the ground. At 17 hours, a runner came from Battalion headquarters. Captain Morris wanted numbers. George reported in. 8 confirmed kills in 2 days. 12 rounds fired, 4 misses. Morris nodded, grim-faced. But George was doing the math in his head. Intelligence said there were 11 snipers operating in the groves. 8 were dead. That left 3. Those 3 would be the best. They were the ones who had survived the longest. They had watched their comrades die. They knew George's tactics. They knew what he looked like. And they would be waiting for him tomorrow. That night, George cleaned the mud from the Winchester's action. He barely slept. The rain returned at 4:15 a.m. on January 24th, delaying the dawn. George used the darkness and the weather to move again. He couldn't use the fallen tree. They would have that spot sighted in by now. He needed somewhere unexpected. He chose a cluster of large rocks 70 yards south. It had been an old Marine machine gun nest, long abandoned. It offered good cover and overlapping fields of fire. He crawled into the wet stones, pulled his poncho over the rifle and waited. The rain slowed to a drizzle at 7:43. The jungle woke up. George began to glass the trees. He moved his scope inch by inch, fighting the fatigue in his eyes. At 8:17, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was in a palm tree, 190 yards out. But something was wrong. He was low, only 40 feet up. Every instinct in George's body screamed, "Don't shoot." Snipers lived by height and concealment. This man was barely hidden. The palm fronds offered terrible cover. He was practically advertising his position. It was too easy. George lowered the rifle slightly, his finger hovering outside the trigger guard. He looked at the man in the palm tree. The target was still, too still. It was bait. George realized exactly what they were doing. They were sacrificing a man to catch him. The soldier in the palm tree was the worm on the hook. Somewhere else, watching that tree, was the real shooter waiting for George to fire, waiting for the muzzle flash to reveal George's position so he could put a bullet through his head. George didn't take the shot. Instead, he started scanning the trees around the bait. He looked for the cover position. He looked for the master sniper. It took him 11 agonizing minutes. At 8:28, he found him, 80 yards northwest of the palm tree. A banyan tree 91 feet up. The sniper was buried deep in a fortress of vines and branches. He had a perfect line of sight to George's old position at the fallen tree, and he was watching the bait in the palm. This was the trap. If George fired at the bait, the man in the banyan would kill him. If George fired at the man in the banyan, the sound would give him away before he could work the bolt for a second shot. George made a split-second decision. He would use their own trap against them. He aimed at the decoy in the palm tree. He adjusted for wind. He fired. The decoy jerked and fell from the palm. George didn't watch him fall. The instant the rifle recoiled, he ripped the bolt back, ejected the shell, and slammed a new round home. He swung the barrel violently to the northwest, finding the banyan tree. The master sniper in the banyan reacted exactly as George had predicted. He heard the shot. He turned toward the sound, shifting his body to find the shooter. That shift was his death sentence. The movement revealed him against the dark bark. George was already there. He put the crosshairs on the turning shape and fired. The master sniper crumbled, his rifle clattering down through the branches ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 kills, in less than 5 seconds. But the silence didn't last. George had just fired twice from the same spot. He had revealed his position to everyone in the grove. He grabbed his ammo clips and scrambled over the rocks, throwing himself toward a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He hit the mud of the ditch at 8:34. 6 seconds later, the rocks he had been sitting on were torn apart. Japanese machine gun fire raked the position, chewing up the stone and kicking up massive clouds of dust. They had been watching, waiting, and now they were pouring fire onto the spot where George had been moments ago. He pressed his face into the wet clay of the ditch, the bullets cracking overhead like whips. He counted to 60, forcing his breathing to slow down. He was alive, but he was pinned down, and he had 1 bullet left in the chamber, with his resupply clips buried deep in his pocket. He crawled east, moving toward a shell crater filled with stagnant rainwater. He slid into the water, submerging himself up to his chest. He rested the Winchester on the rim of the mud. 10 snipers were dead. That left one, the 11th sniper. This man was the last survivor. He was the smartest of them all. He hadn't revealed himself during the bait trap. He hadn't fired during the machine gun burst. He was out there, somewhere, watching. George scanned the jungle through his scope. The water in the crater was cold, soaking his uniform, but he didn't feel it. At 9:47 he saw movement, but it wasn't in the trees. It was on the ground, 60 yards south. A shape was crawling through the ferns, moving low and fast. It was moving parallel to the tree line, heading directly for the rocks George had just fled. The 11th sniper wasn't waiting in a tree. He was coming for George on foot. He was hunting him like an infantryman, closing the distance to make sure the kill was confirmed. The Japanese sniper reached the rocks and slid into the position, facing east toward the ditch where he thought George was hiding. He was 38 yards away from George. His back was exposed. It was an easy shot. Center mass. No scope needed. But George didn't pull the trigger. Something stopped him. A cold feeling in the pit of his stomach. This was the last sniper. The best one. Why would he expose his back? Why would he sit in an open position that had just been raked by machine gun fire? It didn't make sense. Unless this wasn't the 11th sniper. Unless this was another decoy. George kept his rifle trained on the man in the rocks, but he forced his eyes to look past him. He scanned the peripheral vision. He looked for the shadow behind the shadow. And then he saw it, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a massive fallen tree trunk, a second Japanese soldier. He wasn't moving, he was waiting. His rifle was aimed directly at the drainage ditch, covering the man in the rocks. There were 2 of them. George was alone. He had a bolt-action rifle that required a manual cycle between shots. There were 2 targets, both ready to fire. If he shot the man in the rocks, the man behind the tree would kill him before he could work the bolt. If he shot the man behind the tree, the man in the rocks would spin around and finish him at point-blank range. He was checkmated. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the crater water. He went down until the murky liquid touched his chin. He held the Winchester up, keeping the action clear of the mud. He had to wait. He had to let them make a mistake. The water in the shell crater was stagnant and smelled of rot. It crept up to George's chin, cold and thick. He held the Winchester vertically, the muzzle just inches above the surface, praying that he hadn't clogged the barrel with mud. He was a ghost in the water. Motionless. Silent. 10 yards away, the Japanese soldier in the rocks was scanning the tree line. 70 yards back, his partner behind the fallen tree was doing the same. They were looking for a man running away. They were looking for a target in the distance. They never imagined their target was submerged in a hole right under their noses. George watched them through the reeds. His muscles screamed to move. The adrenaline was pumping so hard he could hear his own heartbeat thumping against the water. But he didn't twitch. At 10:13 a.m., the soldier in the rocks stood up. He had waited 10 minutes. He had seen nothing. He turned his head and signaled to the partner behind the tree. They exchanged a look and nod that said, "He's gone." He slipped away. They were wrong. Both men began to move east, walking parallel to each other. They were executing a sweep, moving past the crater where George lay hidden. They walked right by him, their eyes fixed on the jungle ahead. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were turned. George didn't rush. He rose from the water slowly, like something born of the swamp. Mud and water cascaded off his uniform. The water dripped from his face, but his eyes were locked on the targets. He raised the Winchester. The stock was slick against his cheek. The soldier who had been in the rocks was closer now, 42 yards away. George put the sight on the center of his back. Crack. The soldier crumpled instantly, dropping into the tall grass. George didn't admire the shot. His hand flew to the bolt. Up, back, forward, down. The brass casing splashed into the water. A fresh round slid into the chamber. The second soldier, the one by the tree, was spinning around. He was raising his rifle, his eyes wide with shock. He was too slow. George fired. The second man fell backward, his rifle flying from his hands. 11 shots, fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George stood alone in the crater, water dripping from his barrel. He had done it. He had cleared the Point Cruz groves. The threat that had paralyzed his battalion for 72 hours was gone. He climbed out of the mud, his chest heaving. He reached for his belt to reload. He had just won the duel. But the war wasn't over. Just as he reached for the spent cartridges, he heard it. A sound that made his blood run cold. Voices. Japanese voices. They weren't coming from a distance. They were coming from the tree line, right where the snipers had come from. And it wasn't just 2 men. It sounded like a squad. George froze. He realized instantly what was happening. The 11 snipers hadn't been working alone. They had infantry support a patrol set to recover the bodies or secure the area. He dropped back into the crater. He didn't slide in gently this time, he dove. The water splashed over his head. He surfaced, gasping, wiping the mud from his eyes. He held the rifle high. The voices grew louder, branches snapped, equipment rattled. George counted the seconds. He could hear them clearly now. They had found the first body, the man he had just shot 42 yards away. The chatter became urgent. They knew they were under attack. Then, the footsteps started moving again. They weren't retreating. They were following his tracks. George had been careful about noise, but he hadn't been careful about the mud. His boot prints led from the rocks directly to the edge of this crater. It was a trail of breadcrumbs leading right to him. He checked the Winchester. He had 3 rounds in the magazine, maybe 4. He couldn't remember if he had topped it off. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the crater. At 10:31 a.m., a Japanese soldier stepped up to the rim and looked down. There was no cover, no shadows. Just George standing in chest-deep water looking up at the enemy. Their eyes met. The soldier opened his mouth to shout, raising his weapon. George fired from the hip, standing in the water. The Winchester roared. The soldier was thrown backward, vanishing from the rim. George worked the bolt with wet, frantic hands. Click-clack. 2 more soldiers appeared at the rim, yelling, their bayonets catching the light. George fired. The man on the left dropped. Click-clack. He swung the barrel to the right, fired it again. The third man collapsed. 3 rounds. 3 hits. But the magazine was empty. Reload. His mind screamed. But there was no time. He could hear more shouting. A lot more. They were swarming the position. George scrambled up the north side of the crater, clawing at the mud, hauling himself out of the water. He didn't look back. He ran. He sprinted 20 yards and dove behind a fallen log, just as the air around him turned into a swarm of angry bees. Crack, 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 crack. Japanese rifle fire chewed up the ground where he had been running. Leaves shredded in the air. Bark exploded off the log. They were firing at the sound, spraying the jungle with lead. George pressed his face into the dirt. He fumbled for his stripper clips. His hands were shaking, slick with mud. He jammed 5 rounds into the magazine, forcing the bolt closed. He risked a glance over the log. 2 soldiers were advancing on the crater, bayonets fixed. They were 50 yards out. George shouldered the rifle. He took a breath, steadied the crosshairs on the lead man's chest, and fired. The soldier dropped. The second man dove for cover. George ducked back down. He heard voices behind him now, and to his right, they were flanking him. One group from the south, another from the east. They were closing the net. He was a sniper, not a machine gunner. He had a bolt-action rifle against semi-automatic weapons. If he stayed here, he would be surrounded and killed within minutes. He had to break contact. He had to run. George grabbed the Winchester and bolted north. He didn't run tactically. He ran for his life. He crashed through the undergrowth, vines tearing at his uniform, branches whipping his face. Behind him, the jungle erupted. Bullets snapped past his ears with that terrifying hiss-crack sound. They struck the trees around him, kicking up geysers of dirt. He ran for 90 seconds straight, his lungs burning, his legs heavy as lead. He saw another shell crater ahead, a dry one, and threw himself into it. He slammed against the dirt wall, chest heaving, listening. Silence. The shouting was distant now. The firing had stopped. They hadn't pursued him. They were regrouping, likely stunned by the ferocity of the defense. George checked his rifle. It was a mess. Mud coated the stock. Water was dripping from the barrel channel. He cycled the bolt, 1 round left. He patted his pockets for ammo. Empty. The rest of his clips were in his pack. And his pack was back near the water-filled crater, surrounded by dead Japanese soldiers. He was alone in the jungle, miles from safety, with 1 bullet. At 10:47 he began to move again. This time he didn't run. He moved like a shadow. He crept northeast toward the American line. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. Every bird call sounded like a signal. But the jungle remained quiet. At 11:13 a.m. he saw the perimeter wire. A Marine sentry challenged him from a foxhole. Flash! The sentry hissed. Thunder! George rasped back. The sentry lowered his weapon and waved him through. George stumbled past him, walking like a man in a dream. He made his way to the battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was there. He looked up as George walked in. The lieutenant was covered in mud from head to toe, soaking wet, holding a rifle that looked like it had been dredged from a swamp. Report, Morris said. George leaned against a tent pole, too tired to stand at attention. 11 snipers killed, sir. 4 days. 12 rounds fired. Morris's eyes widened. And the gunfire we heard just now. Infantry patrol, sir, George said. 3 more kills. 5 rounds fired. I'm down to 1 bullet. Morris looked at the rifle. Then he looked at George. Clean that weapon, Lieutenant, and get some sleep. We're moving out tomorrow. George returned to his tent. He sat on his cot and stripped the Winchester. He spent 2 hours cleaning it with oil and patches until the bore shone like a mirror. He had survived. The rifle had survived. But as he oiled the bolt, George knew one thing for certain. His war wasn't over. In fact, for a man with his specific set of skills, it was just beginning. The next morning the call came down from division headquarters. George was summoned to the command tent. He walked there with a knot in his stomach. In the army, when a lieutenant operates alone, breaks protocol, and disappears for 4 days, he usually doesn't get a medal. He gets a court-martial. George wondered if Captain Morris had filed a report for unauthorized engagement or excessive risk. He stepped into the tent, bracing himself for a reprimand. Captain Morris was there, but he wasn't alone. Sitting next to him was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry didn't look angry. He looked curious. He had the look of a man who had just found a $100 bill on the sidewalk and was trying to figure out how to spend it. Lieutenant, Ferry said, leaning forward. That was some shooting out there. Thank you, sir. You cleared the groves, Ferry continued. 1 man. 1 rifle. But we've got a problem. The Japanese aren't just in the groves. They're everywhere, and I can't clone you. Ferry paused, letting the silence hang in the hot, stagnant air of the tent. But maybe, the colonel said, you can clone yourself. Can you teach other men to do what you just did? George hesitated. Shooting is a lonely art. It takes years of patience. Years of learning to slow your heart rate, to read the wind, to become one with the weapon. You can't teach instinct overnight. I can try, sir, George said. But I need the right men, and I need the right rifles. Ferry smiled. I've got 14 Springfield rifles with unertal scopes. The Marines left them behind because they were too heavy to carry. And I've got 40 men in the regiment who qualified as expert marksmen back in the States. They can shoot paper targets all day long. I need you to teach them how to shoot back. George had one condition. A selfish one perhaps, but necessary. "I'll do it, sir. But I keep my Winchester." Ferry agreed. The training began on January 27th. It wasn't a classroom, it was a muddy clearing 2 miles east of Henderson Field. George looked at the 40 men assembled before him. They were good soldiers. They could hit a bullseye at 500 yards on a calm day in Georgia, but they had never looked through a scope at a living human being who was looking back at them. George started with the basics. He taught them that the rifle wasn't a weapon, it was an extension of their body. He taught them to breathe not just to inhale, but to pause between heartbeats. He introduced them to the concept of the sniper team. In the jungle, a lone wolf dies. George had learned that the hard way at the crater. If you're alone, you have no eyes in the back of your head. He paired them up. One shooter, one spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a semi-automatic Garand for protection. His job was to find the target and watch the shooter's back. The shooter's job was to end the threat. For 3 days they drilled. They shot at stationary targets. They shot at moving targets. They learned to drape wet burlap over their scopes to hide the glint of the sun. By January 30th, George had whittled the group down. 32 men made the cut. They were ready. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear the Japanese positions west of the Matanikau River. This was the testing ground. George paired himself with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They moved silently through the undergrowth, climbing to a high ridge overlooking a resupply trail. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier stepped onto the trail below. Hayes spotted him first. Target. Trail. 2 o'clock. George shifted his Winchester. He didn't feel the nervousness he had felt on that first day in the bunker. This was business now. He acquired the target. Crack. The soldier dropped. Hayes scanned the tree line. Clear. No movement. Over the next 6 hours, George's team locked down that trail. 7 Japanese soldiers tried to use it. 6 died. 1 survived only because the wind shifted at the last second. But it wasn't just George anymore. The jungle echoed with the distinct cracks of the Springfield rifles from the other teams. By sunset, the reports came in. 23 Japanese soldiers killed in 1 day, 0 American casualties. The mail-order rifle wasn't a joke anymore. It was a doctrine. For the next week, George's sniper section became the most feared unit on the island. By February 9th, they had 74 confirmed kills. They were ghosts in the jungle, striking from distance, vanishing before the enemy could return fire. The Japanese evacuation turned into a nightmare. They couldn't move during the day. They were being hunted by a force they couldn't see. But war is a game of odds, and eventually the house always wins. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tanamboa River. He was confident. Maybe too confident. He was moving forward, looking for a better vantage point to cover the Japanese retreat when the jungle exploded. It wasn't a sniper shot. It was a standard infantryman hidden in the brush 20 yards away. The bullet slammed into George's left shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer. The impact spun him around and threw him into the mud. The pain was blinding. A hot, searing poker drove through his muscle. His left arm went dead. Hayes was there instantly. He grabbed George by his webbing and dragged him backward, firing his Garand blindly into the brush to suppress the enemy. "Medic!" Hayes screamed. George lay in the dirt, staring up at the canopy. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold shock. He checked his arm. The blood was bright red, pulsing. The bullet had missed the bone and the artery, but it had torn through the muscle. His war on Guadalcanal was over. He was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound, stitched him up, and told him he was lucky. A few inches to the right, and he would have been coming home in a box. He spent 2 weeks recovering. From his hospital cot, he heard the news. The Japanese had evacuated. Cape Esperance was empty. The campaign was won. George was recommended for a Bronze Star. His sniper section was officially recognized. He had done his job. He could have gone home. He could have taken a medical discharge, gone back to Illinois, and spent the rest of his life shooting paper targets at the state fair. But John George wasn't done. While he healed, a new order came down from Pacific Command. The Army was looking for experienced officers for a special mission. It was classified. Dangerous. It required men who knew the jungle. men who could operate behind enemy lines for months without support. It was a suicide mission in all but name. They were going to a place called Burma. George looked at his shoulder, stiff and sore. He looked at his Winchester, leaning against the hospital tent pole. He volunteered. By March, he was on a transport ship heading west across the vast, blue expanse of the Pacific. The mail-order rifle was packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. He didn't know the details yet. He didn't know that he was joining a unit that would become legendary. A unit of misfits and hard cases known as Merrill's Marauders. He only knew one thing. The jungle in Guadalcanal had been bad. But the jungle in Burma? The veterans on the ship whispered about it. They said Burma was hell on earth. Steeper mountains, deeper mud, and an enemy that wasn't retreating, an enemy that was digging in for the fight of their lives. George stood on the deck, watching the wake of the ship. He wasn't the same man who had unpacked a civilian rifle in a Tennessee training camp. He was a hunter now, and he was heading into the biggest hunt of the war. Burma wasn't just another battlefield. It was a green hell. If Guadalcanal had been a steaming sauna, Burma was a drowning pool. The mountains were vertical walls of mud. The rivers were swollen torrents. And the enemy, the Japanese 18th Division, was digging in, waiting to turn the jungle into a graveyard for the Americans. John George arrived in India in April 1943. He stood in a dusty briefing room with 200 other officers. They were told they were joining a new unit. It had a boring, bureaucratic name, the 5307th Composite Unit, Provisional. But the men didn't call it that. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. Their mission sounded suicidal. They were to walk into the jungle behind Japanese lines. No tanks, no trucks, no artillery. Just 3,000 men and a train of pack mules carrying everything on their backs. They were to march hundreds of miles through impassable terrain to capture the critical airfield at Guadalcanal. George looked at his gear. In this kind of war, weight was the enemy. Ounces equaled pounds and pounds equaled pain. He looked at his beloved Winchester Model 70, the rifle that had cleared the groves of Point Cruz, the mail-order sweetheart. It was too heavy. At 9 pounds 12 ounces it was a burden. On a 20-mile march up a mountain, it would feel like an anchor. George made a hard choice. He stripped the rifle down. He removed the heavy Lyman Alaskan scope, the optic that had spotted the hidden snipers on Guadalcanal, and replaced it with the Weaver 330. It was smaller, cheaper, but it weighed 8 ounces less. He swapped the heavy wooden stock for a lighter version he had sourced. He shaved the rifle down to 8 pounds, 14 ounces. It wasn't much, but over 700 miles of marching, those saved ounces would keep him alive. The Marauders stepped into the jungle in February 1944. They vanished from the civilized world. The march was a nightmare from day one. The trails were so steep that mules lost their footing and tumbled into ravines, screaming as they fell. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Malaria didn't just visit, it took up residence. Dysentery turned tough soldiers into ghosts. But they kept moving. They were a ghost army, appearing out of the mist to strike Japanese outposts, and vanishing before the enemy could react. George's role had changed. He wasn't just a sniper anymore, he was a platoon leader. He was responsible for the lives of men who were sick, tired, and scared. But the Winchester was still slung over his shoulder. The combat in Burma was different. It wasn't the slow, calculated chess match of the sniper duels on Guadalcanal. It was fast, violent, and chaotic. Engagements happened at 50 yards in bamboo, so thick you couldn't see your own hand. The Garand rifles of his men would roar bang, 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 filling the air with lead. George rarely fired. The bolt-action Winchester was too slow for a firefight. It was a surgeon's scalpel in a room full of hammers, but sometimes the hammer wasn't enough. In March, the battalion was pinned down near a river crossing. A Japanese officer, standing on a ridge 412 yards away, was directing mortar fire onto the Americans. He was out of range of the Tommy guns. He was a small, blurry target for the iron sights of a Garand. He thought he was safe. George slid into a prone position in the mud. He wiped the sweat from the Weaver scope. The magnification was low, barely enough to see the officer's gestures. The Marauders around him were taking cover, dirt kicking up from the mortar rounds. George ignored the explosions. He focused on the breathing. In, out, pause. He held above the target, compensating for the drop of the .30-06 round over 4 football fields. Crack. The sound of the Winchester was different, sharp, distinct. 400 yards away, the Japanese officer crumpled. The mortar fire stopped. George worked the bolt, picked up his brass casing, and kept moving. 1 shot, 1 kill. He used the rifle 3 times during that grueling 3-month death march. Once at 380 yards against a heavy machine gunner who was tearing up their flank. 1 shot silenced the gun. Once at 290 yards against a Japanese sniper who had pinned down a patrol. The duel lasted 5 seconds. George won. But as the weeks dragged on, George realized something profound. The era of the mail-order rifle was ending. What was changing? It was becoming industrial. It was about volume of fire, air support, mass production. The M1 Garand, with its 8 semi-automatic rounds, was the future. The sniper, the lone hunter with his custom weapon, was becoming a relic of a different time. By the time the Marauders reached the Merrill airfield in May, they were barely an army. They were skeletons wrapped in green fatigues. Of the 3,000 men who had marched in, fewer than 1,000 were still standing. They had lost more men to typhus and malaria than to bullets, but they took the airfield. They accomplished the impossible. George survived the green hell. His Winchester survived with him, battered, scratched, the finish worn off by the jungle rot. He was evacuated in June 1944, flown out on a C-47 transport plane. He looked down at the jungle one last time. He would never fire his rifle in anger again. George returned to the United States a hero, promoted to captain, then lieutenant colonel. He wore 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He was assigned to Fort Benning to teach young officers how to shoot. He taught them everything he knew. He taught them about the wind, about the patience, about the one-shot philosophy. But he saw the future in their eyes. They were training for a different war, a war of automatic weapons and jet engines. The Winchester Model 70 went into a footlocker. George went on to live a full life. He went to Princeton. He studied at Oxford. He became a diplomat and an expert on African affairs. He walked the halls of power in Washington, D.C., wearing suits and ties. Most of his colleagues had no idea. They didn't know that the soft-spoken intellectual had once lain in a water-filled crater for an hour, waiting to kill 2 men. They didn't know he had cleared a coconut grove single-handedly. But George never forgot. In 1947, he sat down and wrote a book. He called it Shots Fired in Anger. It wasn't a glory story. It was a technical, precise, and brutally honest account of what happens when a man and a rifle go to war. It became a classic, a Bible for historians and marksmen. John George died in 2009 at the age of 90. And the rifle, the mail-order sweetheart that the officers had laughed at, it didn't end up in a pawn shop. It didn't rust away in a basement. It sits today in the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It rests behind a pane of thick glass under a spotlight. If you walk past it, you might miss it. It looks like just another old hunting rifle. The wood is scratched, the metal is worn. It doesn't look like a weapon of war, but if you look closer, you can feel it. You can feel the heat of Guadalcanal radiating from the steel. You can feel the tension of the trigger that broke like glass. It stands there as a silent testament to a different kind of soldier. A man who didn't rely on spray-and-pray tactics. A man who bought his own gun, learned his own trade, and when the world fell apart, stood his ground and made every single shot count. They mocked his rifle. They called it a toy. But in the end, that toy saved a battalion. And that is a story that should never be forgotten. If this story moved you, if you felt the tension in that crater and the heat of the jungle, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button. It takes you half a second, but it tells YouTube that these forgotten stories matter. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We are digging up the most incredible untold history from the archives every single week. Join the community. Turn on that notification bell so you never miss a mission. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever fired a Winchester Model 70? Do you think modern soldiers should still be allowed to carry their own personal weapons? Or is standardization better? Let's get a debate going down below. I'm World War II Archie, and I'll see you in the next video. Keep the history alive.